The fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed overhead as I slumped against the cold metal chair, my black funeral suit wrinkled from 13 hours of travel. 3 days earlier, I had buried my wife, Sarah, in the Emerald Hills of Dublin, Ireland, where her childhood home overlooked the Irish Sea. At 28 years old, Sarah had collapsed in our kitchen from a brain aneurysm that doctors said was impossible to predict or prevent. The funeral had been a blur of Irish relatives I barely knew offering condolences in accents thick as morning fog. Now I sat alone in Terminal 3, surrounded by bustling travelers heading to happier destinations. My phone felt heavy in my trembling hands as I opened our family group chat and typed the words that would change everything forever. I stared at the screen displaying my simple message in the Collins family chat group. Flight lands at 4 p.m. today. Can someone pick me up? The typing indicators appeared immediately, and my heart lifted for the first time in weeks. Finally, my family would be there for me during the darkest period of my life. Jake, my older brother, responded first. We're busy today. Try Uber or something. Before I could process that gut punch, my mother Patricia added her own response. Why didn't you plan better, Murray? We talked about this trip weeks ago. The words hit me like physical blows. These were the people who had raised me, who I had supported through countless crises, who claimed blood was thicker than water. I sat motionless for several minutes, watching other passengers reunite with loved ones, their faces bright with joy and anticipation. Meanwhile, my family couldn't spare 2 hours to drive 40 minutes each way and help their grieving son and brother. I typed back 2 words that felt like swallowing glass. No worries. The taxi ride home to Oak Park cost me $87, but the financial pain paled compared to the emotional devastation. The driver, a kind Ethiopian man named Solomon, noticed my funeral attire and offered gentle conversation about loss and healing. A complete stranger showed me more compassion than my own flesh and blood. My house stood dark and silent when we pulled into the driveway. Sarah's flower garden had begun to wilt in my absence, the purple petunias she had planted just before her death, now drooping toward the earth, like mourners at a graveside. I dragged my suitcase up the front steps, each footfall echoing through the empty neighborhood. Inside, the silence felt suffocating. Sarah's coffee cup still sat in the sink where she had left it that final morning. Her reading glasses rested on the kitchen counter next to a half-finished crossword puzzle. The house felt like a museum, dedicated to a life cut tragically short. My phone buzzed with notifications, and I foolishly hoped for messages of support or apology from my family. Instead, I found myself staring at a series of photos posted in our family group chat. Jake had shared pictures from what appeared to be an elaborate backyard barbecue party. The first image showed him flipping burgers on his expensive new grill beer in hand, grinning widely. The second featured my parents sitting at a picnic table raising champagne glasses in a toast, their faces flushed with laughter. The timestamp on the photos made my blood run cold. They had been posted 3 hours earlier, right around the time I was delivering Sarah's eulogy to a cemetery full of her Irish relatives and childhood friends. While I stood in the Dublin rain, speaking about my wife's kindness and dreams for our future, my family had been celebrating something trivial in suburban Chicago. I scrolled through more images with growing disbelief. My sister-in-law Diana posed with an elaborate cake, shaped like a house celebrating their mortgage approval for a vacation cabin. My parents looked genuinely happy, more animated than I had seen them in years. The contrast between their joy and my devastation felt surreal. The final photo showed the entire group around Jake's fire pit making s'mores and telling stories. The caption read, "Family time is the best time." Everyone was accounted for except me. They had known about my return flight for 2 weeks. They had my itinerary. They had chosen this celebration over supporting me through the worst experience of my adult life. I walked through the house, past the sympathy cards that neighbors and co-workers had dropped off, past the casserole dishes from Sarah's book club, friends, past the beautiful flower arrangements from people who barely knew us, but understood the importance of showing up during grief. My family, the people who had known me for 32 years, couldn't be bothered to interrupt their party planning. I settled into Sarah's favorite reading chair, a burgundy velvet armchair positioned near the bay window, where morning sunlight would stream across her face as she read mystery novels. The fabric still held traces of her lavender perfume. Surrounded by genuine expressions of sympathy from near strangers, I felt the last thread of connection to my birth family finally snap. Sarah had always been gentle in her observations about my family dynamics, but she had noticed patterns I refused to acknowledge. She would point out how they only called when they needed something, how they dismissed my achievements while expecting financial support during their struggles, how they treated our marriage like an inconvenient phase I would eventually outgrow. Now, sitting in her chair with photographic evidence of their callousness, I understood that Sarah had been protecting me from a truth I wasn't ready to face. My family didn't just take me for granted. They actively resented my independence and happiness. I opened a new notebook and began documenting everything with timestamps and screenshots. Something about the systematic recording felt like honoring Sarah's memory. She had been a research analyst who believed in evidence-based decision-making. If she were here, she would tell me to gather facts before making emotional choices. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs that sounded almost conversational. For the first time since Sarah's death, I didn't feel completely alone. I felt purposeful. I was beginning to see clearly, and what I discovered would transform everything. The following morning brought the overwhelming task of sorting through Sarah's belongings. I had been dreading this moment since her death, knowing that each item would trigger fresh waves of grief. I started with her home office, a cozy corner room, where she had managed our finances and pursued her freelance graphic design projects. Sarah had been methodical about organization with labeled file folders and color-coded systems for everything from tax documents to recipe collections. As I worked through her desk drawers, I discovered something that stopped me cold. Hidden beneath a stack of client invoices was a leather-bound journal I had never seen before. The cover bore no title, just Sarah's initials embossed in gold lettering. I opened it hesitantly, expecting to find personal reflections about our marriage or her creative projects. Instead, I found page after page of detailed observations about my family interactions, complete with dates, direct quotes, and behavioral analysis that read like a psychological case study. The first entry was dated 3 years earlier, shortly after our engagement. Sarah had written, "Murray seems genuinely confused when his mother Patricia criticizes his career choices during family dinners. He apologizes for pursuing journalism instead of law school, even though his writing has won regional awards. Patricia never acknowledges his professional success, but frequently mentions how much her friends' children earn in more traditional careers. Murray changes the subject when I point this out later." I continued reading with growing amazement. Sarah had been documenting my family's treatment of me with scientific precision noting patterns I had never recognized. She recorded conversations where my brother Jake made subtle digs about my sensitivity, calling me emotional or dramatic whenever I expressed genuine feelings. She noted how they borrowed money from me, but never acknowledged these loans publicly, allowing them to maintain their image as financially responsible while quietly relying on my support. One particularly painful entry described my father's funeral 2 years earlier. Sarah had written, "Murray delivered a beautiful eulogy and handled all funeral arrangements while grieving his father's death. His family praised the service, but immediately began discussing inheritance distribution during the reception. No one thanked Murray for his emotional labor or acknowledged his leadership during crisis. Jake actually complained that the flowers Murray chose were too expensive, even though Murray paid for everything. The journal revealed how Sarah had been building a comprehensive case to protect me from emotional manipulation I couldn't recognize. She had documented dozens of family gatherings where I was expected to provide financial assistance, emotional support, or logistical coordination while receiving criticism or indifference in return. Her final entries, written just weeks before her death, outlined a detailed intervention plan. Sarah had been preparing to sit down with me and present evidence of my family's systematic emotional abuse. She wrote, "Murray deserves relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. His family treats him like an emotional servant and financial safety net. I need to help him understand that their behavior is not normal family dynamics. Love should not require constant sacrifice of self-worth." But Sarah's intervention never happened because fate had other plans. I moved to her computer and found even more devastating evidence. Sarah had been secretly recording family dinners and phone conversations, creating an audio archive of my family's true feelings about me and our marriage. She had used a small digital recorder tucked into her purse, capturing conversations that revealed their genuine opinions when they thought I couldn't hear. One recording from last Christmas made me physically ill. While I was in the kitchen preparing dessert, my family had discussed me like I was an absent child. My mother's voice came through clearly. "Murray has always been my most difficult child. Too sensitive, too emotional about everything. That wife of his just enables his weakness." Jake's voice followed. "I keep waiting for him to grow out of this phase and realize that blood family comes first. Sarah has him wrapped around her finger, making him think he needs to choose between us and her." Diana, my sister-in-law, added her own commentary. "She's always been jealous of our family bond. I can see it in her eyes during holidays. She wants Murray all to herself." The conversation continued with my mother speculating about our marriage prospects, and Jake suggesting that Sarah was manipulating me away from family loyalty. Not once during the 15-minute recording did anyone acknowledge my happiness, my accomplishments, or Sarah's positive influence on my life. Another recording from my birthday dinner 6 months earlier captured my mother telling my aunt that I had always been her least favorite child, too much like my father's side of the family, with their impractical dreams and emotional needs. She said Sarah had made me worse by encouraging my writing career instead of pushing me toward more lucrative professions. I sat in Sarah's office chair, surrounded by evidence of love I had taken for granted. While I had been obliviously trying to balance family expectations with marital happiness, Sarah had been quietly documenting years of emotional abuse disguised as normal family dynamics. She had seen what I couldn't, my family's systematic devaluation of my worth as a human being. The most heartbreaking discovery was a voice memo Sarah had recorded for herself just days before her death. Her familiar voice filled the room as she spoke about her intervention plans. "I love Murray too much to watch his family destroy his self-esteem. They have convinced him that their treatment is normal, that all families operate through guilt and obligation rather than genuine care. I need to show him the pattern so he can choose healthier boundaries. He deserves to understand the difference between family love and family manipulation." She had been protecting me from a truth I wasn't emotionally ready to handle. But now, sitting alone in the aftermath of her death and my family's cruel indifference to my grief, I finally understood what Sarah had been trying to save me from. My family didn't just take me for granted. They actively resented my independence, my happiness, and my wife's positive influence on my life. They had been waiting for Sarah to disappear so they could reclaim their emotional control over me. The irony was devastating. In death, Sarah had finally given me the intervention she never got to deliver in life. 2 weeks after my return from Ireland, I was still processing Sarah's devastating documentation when my family's true nature revealed itself even more starkly. It was a Tuesday evening when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway, followed by the familiar sounds of my family letting themselves into my house without knocking or calling ahead. They had maintained their tradition of monthly family dinners at my house, a custom that began years earlier when Sarah and I had the largest dining room. Even after Sarah's death, they apparently expected me to continue hosting these gatherings, as if nothing had fundamentally changed in my world. My mother, Patricia, walked through the front door like she owned the place immediately, beginning her usual commentary about my appearance and housekeeping standards. "Your hair needs cutting, Murray, and this place smells musty. You need to open some windows and get fresh air circulating." Behind her, my brother Jake carried a cooler full of beer and started making himself comfortable on my couch. He barely glanced in my direction before launching into his own agenda. "I need to borrow your truck this weekend for moving some furniture. Diana found this antique dresser at an estate sale, and it won't fit in our car." My sister-in-law Diana followed them inside, wrinkling her nose at the lingering scent of the sympathy flowers that were beginning to wilt in various rooms throughout the house. She settled into Sarah's reading chair without permission, immediately rearranging the throw pillows to suit her preferences. Not one person mentioned Sarah's name or acknowledged that I might still be grieving the loss of my wife just 3 weeks earlier. They spread themselves throughout my living room with the casual entitlement of people who expected service and entertainment without offering anything in return. I stood in my own doorway feeling like an outsider in my own home. The contrast between their behavior and the gentle consideration shown by neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers was striking. My mailman had stopped to offer condolences and share a story about losing his own spouse. The teenager who delivered groceries had noticed my wedding ring and quietly asked if I was doing okay. Complete strangers treated my loss with more respect than my own blood relatives. As I moved around the kitchen preparing dinner from Sarah's recipe collection, my family continued their conversation as if I were invisible. Patricia launched into detailed criticism of my recent choices, suggesting that Sarah's death might actually be beneficial for my personal growth, since I could now focus on family obligations without distraction. The comment hit me like a physical blow, but my family didn't notice my reaction. They continued talking about vacation plans, work gossip, and neighborhood drama, while I struggled to breathe normally. Jake mentioned they were planning a family reunion cruise for next spring and suggested I should pay for our parents' cabin as my contribution to the family celebration. Diana chimed in with enthusiasm about the cruise plans, describing excursion possibilities and dining packages as if my wallet was automatically available for their entertainment. She mentioned that Patricia had been hesitant about the expense, so having Murray cover the costs would make everything possible. Throughout dinner, they discussed me in third person while I sat at the same table. Patricia speculated about whether I would sell the house now that it was too large for one person. Jake suggested I move closer to their neighborhood so they could keep a better eye on me. Diana wondered aloud whether Sarah had left any valuable jewelry or artwork that might need family oversight. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Patricia suggested that I should remove Sarah's photographs from the common areas because they made the house feel depressing for visitors. She recommended redecorating with a more masculine aesthetic that would help me move forward emotionally. Jake nodded in agreement, adding that keeping shrine-like displays of Sarah's belongings was unhealthy and would prevent me from healing properly. He suggested donating her clothes and personal items to charity as soon as possible before sentimentality made the task more difficult. I listened to them casually dismantling my wife's memory and my grief process as if they were discussing weekend plans or television shows. Their complete lack of empathy was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. When Diana mentioned that maintaining the house was probably beyond my capabilities, as a single man, suggesting I hire their friend's cleaning service to keep things presentable for family gatherings, I finally understood the full scope of their expectations. They saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a human being to be supported. The evening reached its breaking point when Patricia stood up from the dinner table and began physically removing Sarah's photographs from the mantelpiece, placing them face down in a cardboard box she had apparently brought for this purpose. She explained that she was helping me take the first step toward emotional recovery by creating a less triggering environment. I watched my mother pack away images of my wife with the casual efficiency of someone clearing away seasonal decorations. In that moment, everything Sarah had documented in her secret journal crystallized into perfect, painful clarity. My family hadn't come to support me through grief. They had come to accelerate my emotional recovery so I could resume serving their needs without the inconvenient distraction of mourning my dead wife. I sat at my own dining room table, surrounded by the people who had known me longest, and felt more isolated than I had during the loneliest moments of international travel or late-night grief counseling sessions with strangers. The realization that struck me wasn't anger or sadness, but rather a cold, clear understanding that everything was about to change. Sarah had given me the tools to see this pattern. Now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. As they prepared to leave, expecting their usual gratitude for gracing me with their presence, Jake reminded me about borrowing the truck, and Patricia mentioned that she would return next week to continue helping me organize Sarah's belongings for donation. I smiled and nodded and thanked them for coming just as I had done for years. But this time I was already planning something they never would have imagined I was capable of complete independence from their emotional manipulation. The evening had revealed their true character so starkly that even I couldn't ignore it anymore. Sarah's intervention was finally taking effect just months too late for her to witness my awakening. The morning after that devastating family dinner, I began implementing the boundary-setting strategies Sarah had outlined in her hidden journal. Her research had included detailed advice about reducing emotional availability to manipulative family members, while maintaining superficial politeness to avoid immediate confrontation. I started with small changes that felt manageable, but would send clear signals about my shifting priorities. When Jake called 3 days later asking about borrowing my truck, I politely declined, explaining that I needed it for my own errands that weekend. His surprised silence told me everything about his expectations of automatic compliance with family requests. Patricia called the following afternoon, announcing her intention to return and continue organizing Sarah's belongings. I calmly informed her that I had already handled those tasks and no longer needed assistance with household management. The confusion in her voice revealed how accustomed she had become to managing my personal life without invitation. More significantly, I stopped initiating contact with my family entirely. For years, I had been the one calling to check on everyone's well-being, remembering birthdays, coordinating holiday celebrations, and maintaining the emotional connections that kept our relationships functional. When I withdrew that energy, the silence became deafening. 2 weeks into my strategic withdrawal, a development occurred that changed everything dramatically. Sarah's estate attorney contacted me about finalizing the distribution of her assets, including a significant financial component I had been unaware of during our marriage. 3 years earlier, Sarah had made a small investment in her former colleague's technology startup, a company developing software for non-profit organizations. At the time, her $5,000 investment had seemed like a supportive gesture for a friend's entrepreneurial dream. Neither of us expected the company to experience explosive growth or attract major venture capital funding. The attorney explained that Sarah's original investment had multiplied exponentially as the company expanded nationally and went public. Her equity stake was now worth approximately $2 million, making me a sudden and unexpected millionaire. I instructed the attorney to keep this information completely confidential while I processed the implications. The money felt surreal after years of careful budgeting and modest financial goals. Sarah and I had lived comfortably on my journalism income and her freelance design work, never imagining we were sitting on a hidden fortune. More importantly, the inheritance represented Sarah's final gift of independence. She had unknowingly provided me with the financial freedom to make choices based on principle rather than obligation. My family, however, had begun noticing my newfound emotional independence and started probing for explanations. Jake made casual comments about my improved mood and asked pointed questions about life insurance payouts. Patricia hinted about inheriting Sarah's personal belongings, particularly her jewelry collection and art supplies. Diana became more direct in her inquiries, mentioning how expensive grief counseling could be, and suggesting that family support was more valuable than professional therapy. Her comments felt like fishing expeditions designed to assess my financial vulnerability. I realized they were circling like vultures, expecting grief to make me more generous with both emotional and financial resources. Their increased attention felt predatory rather than supportive, confirming Sarah's documented observations about their motivations for maintaining family relationships. During this period, I began establishing new financial systems that would protect my inheritance while honoring Sarah's memory in meaningful ways. I opened separate banking accounts that my family had no knowledge of or access to, ensuring my newfound wealth remained private while I determined the best ways to use it. I also started documenting my family's increasingly desperate attempts to assess my financial situation and emotional vulnerability. Jake stopped by unannounced to borrow tools, spending his visits examining my house for signs of new purchases or lifestyle changes. Patricia called with elaborate stories about her own financial struggles, clearly hoping I would offer assistance, as I had done countless times before. The pattern became increasingly obvious as they ramped up their emotional manipulation tactics. Diana shared detailed accounts of their mortgage struggles and their children's educational expenses, painting pictures of hardship that felt designed to trigger my guilt and generosity. But Sarah's journal had taught me to recognize these patterns for what they truly were: systematic emotional exploitation disguised as family bonding. Armed with that knowledge and the financial freedom to make independent choices, I began planning something they never would have expected. I was going to honor Sarah's memory by breaking free from their manipulation entirely, using her final gift to build a life based on respect rather than obligation. The irony was perfect in its justice. My family had spent years treating Sarah as an obstacle to their emotional and financial access to me. Now her death had provided me with both the insight and the resources necessary to escape their control permanently. I spent quiet evenings in Sarah's reading chair, planning a future she would have been proud of, knowing that her love had finally given me the strength to choose my own happiness over family expectations. The transformation felt like emerging from a decades-long fog into brilliant sunshine. For the first time since childhood, I was making decisions based on my own values rather than family pressure. Sarah's legacy was teaching me what healthy relationships could look like. My carefully maintained privacy about Sarah's inheritance lasted exactly 6 weeks, ending when my mother made one of her unannounced visits to check on my well-being. Patricia had developed a habit of letting herself into my house, using the spare key I had given her years earlier for emergencies, treating my home like an extension of her own domain. I was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she arrived that Thursday morning, moving through my living room with the proprietary confidence of someone who considered my space partially hers. I heard her rustling through papers on my counter, while calling out casual observations about my housekeeping and general life management. When I returned to the living room carrying 2 coffee mugs, Patricia was standing frozen beside my kitchen counter, holding a bank statement that had arrived in yesterday's mail. Her face had gone pale as she stared at the account balance displaying figures she had never associated with my modest journalism income. "Murray," she said slowly, her voice carrying a strange mixture of shock and calculation. "What exactly is this account statement showing?" I realized immediately what had happened. In my grief-induced carelessness, I had left the inheritance account statement visible among routine mail and grocery receipts. The document clearly showed a balance of $1,943,000 representing Sarah's tech investment payout, minus attorney fees and tax allocations. I calmly retrieved the statement from her trembling hands and explained that Sarah's estate had included some unexpected assets that were still being processed. Patricia's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions: surprise, confusion, excitement, and finally a calculating intensity I had never seen before. She immediately called Jake and Diana using my kitchen phone to arrange an emergency family meeting at my house that evening. I listened to her hushed conversation, hearing phrases like substantial inheritance and family discussion and need to plan together. Her tone carried an urgency that felt both predatory and proprietary. By 7 o'clock that evening, my entire immediate family had assembled in my living room with the focused energy of a corporate planning session. They had clearly spent the afternoon discussing strategy and preparing talking points for whatever conversation they intended to have about my financial windfall. Jake took the lead, presenting a detailed proposal for family investment opportunities that would benefit everyone while honoring Sarah's memory. He suggested purchasing a vacation rental property together, creating a family trust fund for his children's education, and establishing a joint account for emergency expenses and family celebrations. Diana contributed enthusiastic support for these ideas, describing how pooled resources could provide financial security for the entire family while creating new traditions and shared experiences. She mentioned researching properties in Wisconsin Lake Country, where we could build lasting memories across generations. Patricia approached the conversation from a more emotional angle, discussing family loyalty and the importance of supporting each other through difficult transitions. She suggested that Sarah would have wanted her inheritance to benefit the people who had known and loved me longest. Their presentation felt rehearsed and coordinated, as if they had spent hours planning the most effective approach to accessing my newfound wealth. Each family member had assigned roles in what amounted to a carefully orchestrated financial intervention. When I politely declined their proposals, explaining that I needed time to process Sarah's death before making major financial decisions, their facade of supportive concern began cracking almost immediately. Jake's tone turned sharp as he reminded me about family obligations and the importance of sharing good fortune with blood relatives. He suggested that hoarding money while family members struggled with mortgages and college expenses was selfish and contrary to the values our parents had taught us. Diana became more direct in her criticism, accusing me of being influenced by grief into making poor decisions that would isolate me from family support. She claimed that Sarah had always been possessive of my attention and resources, and that continuing to prioritize her wishes over family needs was emotionally unhealthy. The conversation reached a breaking point when Patricia delivered a statement that revealed the depth of their resentment toward Sarah and their sense of entitlement to my assets. She said that Sarah had been an outsider who never fully understood our family dynamics, and that her death provided an opportunity to refocus on blood family relationships that should take priority over honoring a dead wife's preferences. Jake nodded emphatically, adding that Sarah had manipulated me against my family for years, encouraging my independence and emotional distance from the people who had loved me since birth. He suggested that my inheritance was actually a form of justice, returning resources to the family unit where they belonged. Diana concluded their arguments by claiming that Sarah's influence had made me selfish and ungrateful, forgetting the countless ways my family had supported me throughout my life. She insisted that my parents deserved financial security in their retirement years, and that my nephew's educational opportunities should take priority over any sentimental attachment to Sarah's wishes. The mask had completely fallen away, revealing years of suppressed resentment toward my wife and their genuine feelings about my role in the family hierarchy. They saw me as a financial resource that Sarah had temporarily diverted from its proper purpose, serving their needs and expectations. Their entitlement was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. Not only did they feel justified in claiming Sarah's inheritance, but they were simultaneously attacking her memory and characterizing her love as manipulation designed to harm my family relationships. I sat quietly through their entire presentation, watching people I had known for 32 years reveal themselves as emotional parasites who viewed my grief as an inconvenient obstacle to accessing my bank account. Their transformation from loving family members to calculating predators happened so quickly that I felt like I was watching a nature documentary about pack hunters isolating vulnerable prey. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. Sarah's journal had already taught me to recognize their manipulation tactics, and her inheritance had given me the financial independence to reject their demands without consequence. As they concluded their aggressive pitch for family financial cooperation, I realized that Sarah's final intervention was about to begin. The evidence she had gathered combined with their own words from this evening would provide everything I needed to expose their true character to our extended family network. Justice was about to be served, and it would arrive in a form they never could have anticipated. I allowed my family to finish their aggressive presentation about accessing Sarah's inheritance, nodding thoughtfully as they outlined their plans for vacation properties and educational trust funds and emergency family accounts. Their sense of entitlement grew more pronounced with each passing minute, as if my compliance was inevitable once they had properly explained my obligations to blood relatives. When they finally paused, expecting my grateful acceptance of their financial guidance, I stood up calmly and walked to Sarah's desk in the corner of the living room. I returned carrying a folder containing legal documents that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the situation. I announced that I had already made decisions about Sarah's inheritance, explaining that the entire amount had been donated to establish the Sarah Collins Foundation for emotional abuse survivors. The foundation would provide therapy resources and financial assistance for people recovering from family manipulation and psychological exploitation within intimate relationships. The silence that followed my announcement felt like the moment before a natural disaster strikes. I watched three faces process information that contradicted everything they had assumed about my character and their influence over my decision-making. Jake was the first to explode his voice, rising to levels that would have concerned the neighbors if my house weren't positioned on a large lot, with mature trees providing sound barriers. He accused me of mental illness, claiming that grief had obviously impaired my judgment, and that the donation could probably be reversed through legal channels if we acted quickly. Patricia's reaction was even more disturbing, as she threatened to contact attorneys about undue influence and questionable mental capacity. She suggested that Sarah had somehow manipulated me from beyond the grave, convincing me to spite my living family in favor of strangers who meant nothing to me personally. Diana's response revealed the depth of her sense of entitlement as she screamed about robbing my nephews of educational opportunities and retirement security for my parents. She accused me of being selfish and vindictive, using money that rightfully belonged to the family to fund some elaborate revenge scheme against people who loved me. I allowed them to vent their fury for several minutes, watching their true personalities emerge without any pretense of love or concern for my well-being. Their anger was entirely focused on financial loss, rather than worry about my emotional state or decision-making process. When their initial outrage subsided into bitter accusations and threats, I revealed the second component of my strategy. I produced the small digital recorder that had been capturing our entire conversation, explaining that I intended to share the audio with our extended family network, including aunts, uncles, cousins, church community members, and neighborhood friends. The recording would demonstrate clearly how they viewed Sarah's death as a financial opportunity and how they characterized grief counseling and independent decision-making as mental illness requiring family intervention. I also retrieved Sarah's hidden journal and the audio recordings she had secretly made during family gatherings over the past 3 years. I explained that she had been documenting their emotional manipulation and financial exploitation tactics, creating a comprehensive record of psychological abuse disguised as normal family dynamics. The final element of my revelation involved playing selected excerpts from Sarah's recordings, including the Christmas conversation, where they discussed my weaknesses and her controlling influence, and the birthday dinner where Patricia told my aunt that I had always been her least favorite child. As their own voices filled my living room speaking words they had never intended for me to hear, I watched them realize that their carefully maintained facade of loving family concern was about to be exposed publicly. Jake attempted to grab the recorder, but I had anticipated that reaction and had already uploaded copies to cloud storage and shared access with my attorney. Diana tried to dismiss the recordings as taken out of context, but the conversations were too lengthy and detailed to support that defense. Patricia made one final desperate attempt to reframe the situation, claiming that families sometimes say things in private that sound harsh, but come from places of love and concern. She suggested that Sarah had violated family trust by recording private conversations proving her manipulative character and justifying their criticism. I responded by reading aloud from Sarah's journal entry about my father's funeral, where she had documented how they criticized my expensive flower choices while I was paying for the entire service and managing all arrangements during my own grief process. The pattern was too consistent and too well documented for them to explain away as misunderstandings or loving concern expressed poorly. I concluded my presentation by offering them a choice that Sarah would have appreciated for its fairness and clarity. They could accept my decisions about the inheritance and commit to rebuilding our relationships based on mutual respect and acknowledgement of past mistakes, or they could continue their toxic behavior and face public exposure of their true character through the evidence Sarah had collected. I explained that the foundation work had already begun providing me with meaningful connections to other survivors of family emotional abuse, giving me a support network that didn't depend on their approval or participation. The choice was entirely theirs, but the days of manipulating me through guilt and obligation were permanently over. Sarah's final intervention had succeeded beyond anything she could have planned. Her love had given me both the insight to recognize their manipulation and the resources to break free from it completely. I set the recordings and journal on my coffee table and told them they had 1 week to decide whether they wanted to be part of my future or continue being part of my problem. For the first time in my adult life, I held all the power in our family dynamic. The sensation was both terrifying and liberating, knowing that everything would change based on their response to this ultimatum. Sarah's legacy was teaching me that healthy relationships require mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice, and that real love supports independence rather than demanding submission. The week following my confrontation with my immediate family brought unexpected responses from directions I hadn't anticipated. Within 48 hours of our heated meeting, my phone began receiving calls from extended family members who had somehow learned about the dramatic revelations. My cousin Rebecca Patricia's sister's daughter called first, with an apology that caught me completely off guard. She explained that she had always suspected something was wrong with how my immediate family treated me, but hadn't known how to address the situation appropriately. Rebecca shared her own observations about family gatherings where my contributions were minimized, and my wife was subtly excluded from conversations. Uncle Dennis, my father's younger brother, contacted me next with stories about conversations he had witnessed, but never challenged. He remembered holiday dinners where Patricia made cutting remarks about my career choices, and Jake dismissed my accomplishments as luck rather than skill. Dennis admitted that he and other relatives had noticed the pattern, but assumed family loyalty required staying neutral. My cousin Mark Jake's age, but from our father's side, revealed that he had recorded some concerning conversations during last year's reunion weekend. He had intended to speak with me privately about my family's treatment, but Sarah's sudden death had made the timing feel inappropriate. Now he offered to share those recordings as additional evidence of their long-standing disrespect. The most surprising support came from church community members who had observed my family's behavior during social events and felt uncomfortable with what they witnessed. Mrs. Henderson, who had known our family for 15 years, called to express admiration for my decision to establish the foundation and shared that she had always found my parents' public criticism of my choices inappropriate and hurtful. Meanwhile, my immediate family's response to my ultimatum revealed their true priorities with crystalline clarity. Instead of offering apologies or requesting family therapy to address their admitted mistakes, they chose escalation and attempted manipulation through other family members. Jake contacted several relatives with his version of events, claiming that I had become mentally unstable following Sarah's death and was being influenced by unscrupulous grief counselors who wanted access to my inheritance. He suggested that the family needed to intervene legally to protect me from making decisions that would harm my long-term financial security. Patricia reached out to our pastor, Reverend Martinez, with concerns about my emotional state and request for spiritual guidance in helping me reconnect with family values and Christian principles of forgiveness. She framed the situation as a prodigal son scenario where grief had led me astray from family loyalty and community connection. Diana attempted to rally support among the wives in our extended family, suggesting that Sarah had been manipulating me against my family for years, and that her posthumous influence through secret recordings represented a continuation of that psychological control. However, their strategy backfired spectacularly when Reverend Martinez contacted me directly to offer pastoral counseling and heard the actual recordings of their private conversations. A man who had dedicated his life to teaching about love, compassion, and family values was horrified by the casual cruelty and financial opportunism he heard in their voices. The pastor requested permission to share selected excerpts with our church's family counseling ministry as examples of how emotional manipulation can masquerade as family concern. He was particularly disturbed by their characterization of Sarah's influence as negative when he remembered her as a kind, supportive wife who encouraged my volunteer work with literacy programs. 6 weeks after my ultimatum, my immediate family made one final attempt at reconciliation, but their approach revealed that they still fundamentally misunderstood the situation. They arrived at my house with written apologies that focused primarily on hurt feelings rather than acknowledging patterns of emotional abuse or accepting responsibility for their treatment of Sarah. Jake's letter apologized for reacting emotionally to my inheritance decisions, but maintained that his concerns about financial planning came from love and worry about my future security. He suggested family therapy sessions, where we could work through communication problems and rebuild trust. Patricia's apology acknowledged that some of her comments about Sarah might have sounded harsh, but explained that her protective instincts as a mother made her cautious about influences that seemed to change my relationship with family. She requested forgiveness for misunderstandings and proposed regular family meetings to improve our connection. Diana's letter was the most revealing, as she apologized for getting upset about the inheritance, but continued to maintain that blood family deserved consideration in major financial decisions. She suggested that the foundation could still benefit from family involvement and oversight to ensure proper management. Their apologies demonstrated that they viewed our conflict as a communication problem, rather than a fundamental issue of respect and boundaries. They were willing to acknowledge hurt feelings, but not the systematic emotional exploitation that Sarah had documented so thoroughly. I responded to their letters with a counter-proposal, that reflected everything I had learned about healthy relationships during months of grief counseling and foundation work. I agreed to begin family therapy sessions, but with specific conditions that would protect my emotional well-being and honor Sarah's memory appropriately. The therapy sessions would be conducted with a counselor specializing in family emotional abuse, and attendance would be mandatory for everyone who wanted ongoing relationships with me. The sessions would address their treatment of Sarah during our marriage, their response to her death, and their expectations about my inheritance decisions. Additionally, they would need to publicly acknowledge their mistakes to the same extended family members they had tried to turn against me, clearing up the false narratives about my mental state and Sarah's character. Most importantly, future contact would depend on their demonstrated ability to respect my boundaries and decision-making autonomy without guilt manipulation or financial expectations. To my genuine surprise, all 3 family members agreed to these conditions within a week. The family therapy sessions began that autumn and proved more transformative than I had dared to hope. Dr. Williams, our counselor, helped my family understand how their communication patterns had created emotional damage over decades. Jake admitted that he had been jealous of my marriage and career satisfaction, recognizing that his criticism came from his own insecurity rather than genuine concern. Patricia acknowledged her favoritism toward Jake and admitted that her treatment of Sarah had been unfair and rooted in fear of losing influence over my life choices. Diana's breakthrough came when she realized that her financial expectations were based on entitlement rather than family love, and that her resentment toward Sarah stemmed from recognizing that my wife encouraged the independence Diana had been trying to undermine. The therapy process took 8 months of weekly sessions, but the results exceeded my most optimistic expectations. My family learned to communicate respect rather than demand it, and they began supporting my foundation work instead of resenting it. Jake volunteered his accounting skills to help manage the foundation's financial operations, finally using his business expertise to support my goals rather than criticize them. Patricia became involved with the foundation's support groups for mothers whose adult children had been manipulated by abusive partners, gaining first-hand understanding of healthy versus controlling parenting approaches. Even Diana found meaningful involvement by contributing her event planning skills to foundation fundraising activities, channeling her organizational talents toward community service rather than family manipulation. The Sarah Collins Foundation grew beyond my wildest expectations during its first year of operation. We provided therapy funding for over 200 survivors of family emotional abuse, supported 12 women leaving financially controlling relationships, and created educational resources that reached thousands of people through social media and community presentations. The Foundation's work connected me with other survivors who shared similar stories of family manipulation disguised as love. Through support groups and volunteer activities, I built a new network of relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and guilt. 18 months after Sarah's death, I met someone whose understanding of healthy boundaries and emotional independence felt like a gift from my late wife. Jennifer was a fellow volunteer at the Foundation who had escaped her own manipulative family situation and dedicated her life to helping others recognize psychological abuse patterns. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally built on shared values about respect, communication, and the importance of choosing family connections based on love rather than DNA. Jennifer understood why Sarah's memory would always be precious to me, and she supported my continued grief processing without jealousy or competition. 2 years after establishing the Foundation, we held our first annual conference featuring speakers, workshops, and survivor testimonials. I was invited to deliver the keynote address about recognizing family emotional manipulation and building healthier relationships. Standing before an audience of 300 survivors, advocates, and mental health professionals, I shared Sarah's story and her posthumous intervention that saved my life from decades of continued emotional abuse. I explained how her love had given me both the insight and the resources necessary to break free from manipulation and build genuine connections with people who valued my well-being. The audience response was overwhelming, with dozens of people approaching afterward to share their own stories of family abuse and express gratitude for the Foundation's work. Many mentioned that hearing about Sarah's secret documentation had inspired them to start keeping their own records of manipulation tactics used against them. I concluded my speech with the life lesson that had emerged from this painful but transformative journey. Family love should lift you up rather than tear you down, and real relationships require mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. True family loyalty means supporting each other's growth and happiness, not demanding submission to others' expectations or guilt-based obligations. Sarah had taught me that choosing healthy boundaries doesn't mean abandoning love. It means creating space for genuine love to flourish. The Foundation continues to grow each year, funded not only by Sarah's inheritance, but by donations from people whose lives have been touched by our work. We've helped thousands of individuals recognize emotional manipulation and build healthier relationships with both biological and chosen family members. My relationship with my immediate family has stabilized into something I never thought possible: genuine respect and mutual support without guilt or obligation. They've learned to love me for who I am rather than who they wanted me to become, and I've learned to maintain connections that honor my values rather than compromise them. 3 years after that devastating text message at Chicago O'Hare, I understand that Sarah's greatest gift wasn't the money that funded our mission, or even the evidence that exposed my family's manipulation. Her greatest gift was teaching me that I deserved relationships based on love rather than control. Every person we help through the Foundation represents another victory for Sarah's vision of emotional freedom and healthy connections. Her legacy lives on in every survivor who learns to recognize their worth and demand the respect they deserve. The journey from that cold airport terminal to this moment of purpose and peace has taught me that sometimes the most loving thing someone can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes their humanity. Sarah's intervention saved my life by teaching me the difference between family dysfunction and family love. Have you ever experienced family relationships that felt more like obligations than genuine connections? What would it mean to you to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than guilt or manipulation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please like this video to help others find these important conversations about healthy family dynamics. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming relationship challenges and building genuine connections that honor your worth as a human being. Most importantly, share this story with someone who might need to hear Sarah's message about recognizing emotional manipulation and choosing relationships that support their growth rather than demand their submission. Thank you for joining me on this journey of healing and discovery. Remember that you deserve love that lifts you up, and it's never too late to build the healthy relationships you've always wanted, but never knew were possible. Until next time, choose connections that honor your heart.